joining us around the US, and I think also from South America, and a couple of other names that I know are coming in around the globe. So I know that the topic of today's conversation is relevant just not for corporate America, but for companies globally as they're attending to take care of diversity, not just for diversity's sake, but for good business practice. And that's really what we'll be talking about today. So I'm going to start sharing some slides here just to keep us on track and focused, and hopefully you can see what I'm seeing and still also see Robin and I. So this webinar here will be circling around the topic of unconscious bias in selecting high potentials, but more specifically looking at diversity and enabling the best talent to reach the most influential roles. Today's webinar is part of a webinar series that we've been running in conjunction with the launch of our research report titled Repairing the Broken Rung. And it's in that report where we here at Pinsight were joined by researchers in George Mason University and Purdue University to conduct the largest comprehensive study of women in leadership positions and how they get there, the HR practices that help them get there, in conjunction with the biases that managers might hold about who has leadership potential. The exciting news is that as of today, that research paper is now available for your access and download. I'll give you some details at the end of our conversation today with my guest about how to access that. But while you have the research paper available at your fingertips, it's also important to get the practitioner perspective and get into the trenches with HR leaders about how to tackle these issues, which is why it is extremely my pleasure to be joined by Robin Kane, both a colleague and HR practitioner in this space. And it will be Robin and I's great pleasure to be having a bit of a fireside conversation about some of the important research findings and why this is relevant for strong businesses. I'll just introduce you, Robin, if you don't mind. I'll give you a little bit of spruiking. Robin joins me from Aurora Organic Dairy as the SVP of People just down the road here in Colorado. Robin leads all of the employee programs, including benefits, recruiting, training, and culture. But Robin's extensive HR experience expands well beyond Aurora Organic Dairy, with a 25-year-long career in multiple industries that include manufacturing, hospitality, consumer packaged goods, computer software, hardware, and public education. And through that long career has led significant changes in global leadership practice, not just in the US, but also Europe, Mexico, Canada, and South America. Robin also, in her spare time, is a professor at the University of Denver, teaching human capital management in DU's Executive MBA program, and is also a board member at the Rocky Mountain People and HR People and Strategy Group to make sure that the HR community in Colorado is keeping abreast of important advances in research and spreading the word on good best practices. And finally, and probably I'm sure, Robin, your most proud achievement of all of that long list is that you're also a mother of 3 young professional women, which gives you, I think, a very three-dimensional perspective on the topic of bias in selecting and preparing diverse groups, in particular women, for leadership positions. Thank you, Robin, for joining me today.
Thank you for having me.
Oh, it's a really great pleasure. For those that don't know me or don't know Pinsight, my name is Michelle Brown. I'm the VP of Client Success, and it's my role to spend my days talking with HR practitioners and leaders around the globe as they're looking to solve problems in both hiring, selection, and leadership development. And we here at Pinsight have worked hard over the last 10 years to democratize the access to high quality assessments and leadership development tools by bringing assessment centers online, ensuring that organizations have easy and cost effective access to high quality assessments. But more importantly, we want to contribute to fair and objective and high quality decision making when it comes to getting the most ready and able people in the roles where they can make the most impact on their organizations, our communities, and also our economy. If you'd like to learn more about Pinsight, you can certainly contact us later. But for the really where we want to jump in today is talk about the research paper and repairing the broken rung. For those that did not catch our last month's webinar, we started to talk about the major research findings, and this is where I really want to get you involved, Robin. As you were looking at the research findings, where some of the things that our research highlighted when we surveyed hundreds of organizations and hundreds of managers about their approach to identifying who achieves those roles in leadership, we found that most organizations will use managerial nominations, but managers were showing significantly high amounts of bias towards identifying men, in particular white men, as having more leadership potential than women. But more importantly, 2/3 of organizations were showing adverse impact in the representation of women and minority groups in their high potential programs and succession plans. Robin, as an HR practitioner, someone that's worked in this field for many, many years, and as a mother, what was your first reaction to those findings?
Well, I have to tell you, Michelle, I was surprised, and I think it was looking at it in black and white or color, as it may be, of the data and really showing how women even are part of the problem of not necessarily promoting or recognizing the talented women on their teams did surprise me. So looking at the data from from an objective point of view, I was surprised, and I started to look back to my own career thinking, were there times in the past that I may have unconsciously made a decision against somebody because of their gender? And I'm sure every one of us in the HR world is thinking the same thing when we read that paper. So, that from that point of view, it was, yep, I get it. When I look at the number of people who are at the top in the organizations that I've been part of, and realizing that while 50% of the women, a little bit more, are college graduates, and they are hopefully going into careers that will promote them and get them up to the senior levels, when you look at the actual C-suites today and you realize that we have not made much progress, in some industries we've actually gone backward in the US, I am not at all surprised to see that how this has played out, because you can see it just around you.
And I think, I think you are not alone in that level of surprise. And to be honest, while we had sort of a gut sense based on what we were seeing, when we were watching some of the results of McKinsey and Lean-In's research about who achieves those CEO roles and the distribution of women and minorities, it really seemed to us as well that, we knew that there was a skewed effect, but we really wanted to dig those few layers deeper to say, well, it's not just a hiring issue or a selection issue. There's many things that go on in HR practices or business practices that influence whether women can achieve those leadership positions and managerial positions. And it's really the contention of the research study and also some of the assumptions from McKinsey's report that was released towards the end of last year, that it's really about helping women and racial minorities get that first step into leadership, and that if women can get into those first initial steps, then the pool and the availability opens. And so I'm curious, Robin, in your own career, in your personal experience, you've been able to achieve a number of leadership positions. What's been your experience with getting to those high level roles and being able to break through the glass ceiling, if you will?
Yeah, so I'm going to start with what I probably would consider a personal example. And I think this was early in one of my roles that I had at a company, realizing that Saturday afternoon, a lot of the, quote, guys would go out and play golf. And the number of women who were included, and I was fairly low in the organization, so it's not like I was considered at that level to be part of the director team. I was probably a specialist or a manager, but realizing the kinds of conversations that happen in these informal situations caused a lot of women at that company to say, you know, we want to make sure that we could be out there at these informal times in our careers to be able to make those connections. So I only share that because it was an aha insight early in my career. Now, did I ever learn how to play golf? No, but there are probably other reasons for that. But, you know, I started my career actually as a teacher, and it was certainly an appropriate area for women to go into. It probably still is, unfortunately, heavily women, because it allows for time off for those women who decide they want to have children. But after a while, I realized that education wasn't my passion. I moved into the business world. And over the course of the next 15 years, had 3 children who are now all in their 20s, one in her early 30s. And each one of the jobs that I moved into, I think I was lucky in that I worked for great bosses who saw some talent in me. And they would say, you know, we're going to promote you, but this job requires travel. And it'd be, being a working parent, even a 2-family house, being gone from my children was not in my best interest, nor in my family's best interest. So I was one of those people who you might look on my resume and say, well, early in her career, she had a lot of stability, and then she started job hopping. And my reasons for job hopping were exactly that. You get recognized, you have to take on more responsibility, you travel. What it did eventually for me is it made me realize that moving to the top of an organization was more limiting because I had not developed those long-term relationships that often get people promoted. It requires you to have trust, especially if you're going to move up to an executive or a senior level role. And you don't build trust if you haven't stayed at a company for a long time. Now, of course, that's my situation, but I know we have a lot of single parents out there and even a lot of people without children who also say, I'm not looking for a job that requires X, Y, and Z. I just want to be recognized for my skills and my talents. But I think it does put people at a disadvantage who are not part of that fabric of a company. They're not in one place for a long time. And I think it does disadvantage women, especially.
And I think your point there is about, early in your career feeling like you needed to choose a career that was family friendly, but it didn't necessarily match your passions or your competencies, and that as you transitioned into the business world, it was a better fit. You could contribute more. Your skills and competencies enabled you to be successful, but a unique pressure of being a mother as well as a professional was the potential impact and limitations for sponsorship, visibility, being where the decisions are made at the golf course or etc. And how did you overcome it?
I wanted to add one more thing because it just is so vivid in my mind. And even though my kids are grown up now, I remember my husband and I being the last parents to pick up our children at after-school care. Even when I wasn't traveling, 6:01 p.m. and typically school care closes at that time, and there would be my daughters are in the room together, waiting for mom or dad to pick them up. And I think it was that sense of commitment you have to the company where I need to make sure, and I know this is not about working parents, but it really flows very closely into that sense that we have to, how do we do both and how do we do it so that we're looked at as a player and someone who can reach the senior executive levels. So it's I think it served my daughters well. They're professional. Their careers are important to them. And I think, we're proud that we raise children who look at their career importantly, but I also want them to be able to move into a world where they're able to have both.
And I think that really stems into my next question. As a business leader and a mother of young professional women, when you look around at the opportunities for women and when you look at the research about how future leaders are selected and groomed, are you concerned about where we are today? And are you concerned about the absence of diversity, or do you have a sense of hope for where we could go?
I always have to have a sense of hope. So I think that's really important. But there are things that we talked about earlier that we have not made progress, and in a few industries we've probably backtracked in the last few years, more in the US maybe than in Europe, which I think is putting some interesting requirements in place for board diversity especially. But one of the things that I realized, having spent a good 15 of my business years in consumer packaged goods, it was early drilled into me that the primary customer in actually most consumer spending in the world, but certainly in the US, is made by women. And it's so interesting when you think about that. And I don't want to quote a number, but I know it's 80% in that range of GDP, or at least of consumer purchases, are made by women. That makes you realize that we need people who are in the senior executive suite who understand who their constituents are and who their customers are. And so without having that reflection of understanding and really getting inside the skin of a female, at least adding that diversity to a senior team, I think it is a stress for the industry and for the economy in general. From a point of view of just career happiness, not everybody wants to move up to a senior suite level, but if somebody does, and they feel like they're being held back because of their gender, because of their ethnicity or their race, any other kind of bias, certainly age falls in there, that's a concern. And that's not just a concern for that individual. It really affects society as a whole if we have generations of women who are not able to really self-actualize in their senior roles. And then finally, I guess it comes from an equity point of view and feeling that why shouldn't somebody be able to move up? What is holding somebody back? If it's this unconscious bias, there's no factual or objective reason why these people should not be able to get promoted. It just doesn't feel right. So it comes to more of a sense of ethics and what's equitable.
I think those are important points, Robin. I hear you talking about, if you're a customer-centric, consumer-oriented organization, you must consider what are the consumer drivers, and having more diversity, is critical to be able to have a sense of making decisions on behalf of the constituents and the beneficiaries of your products and services. Secondly, if we want to have a successful economy, and heaven knows many of us are thinking about both personal health and safety and the economic situation that we're in today, we have to be having as much participation of everyone that's capable and willing involved. And if we're keeping women maybe outside of the roles where they are both capable and able to fulfill, then we're not achieving our full potential as an economy. And finally, the ethical ramifications, I think, is an excellent point, Robin, about what is fair and equitable, and again makes us for a democratic, fair, free society. And it just doesn't sound like these practices would reflect that.
That's right.
Yeah, nicely said. What then can be done? Because, I think some of the results of the current paper, really suggest that it's now becoming more and more incumbent on organizations to take action, that, we can't just sort of wait for evolution to move. That I think, and again, I'm going to get these numbers wrong, but I think that there's some, remarkable and horrifying statistics about when, how long we will be waiting, and it certainly won't be in my generation or even your children's lifetime before women achieve pay equity. I think, at the current rate of change, women will have achieved 1% more leadership positions in the next 10 years. What are the things that organizations need to be doing, and maybe even HR practitioners can start to influence to start to move the needle for better equity, for better businesses and a stronger economy?
Yeah. So much of it, I think, starts with what your study points out too. It's being aware and accepting the fact that what we think we might be making decisions on isn't necessarily true. I think back to a leadership group that is primarily for women in the food service industry that I participated in a conference, probably a decade ago. So it's been a while. And one thing that resonated, there was a panel of senior leaders who were talking about diversity in the workplace. It was primarily for women in the workplace. And one executive at a very, very large consumer goods company in the US stood up on the stage in front of thousands of women and men and said, I finally realized what was happening when my daughter reached high school age, and she was looking around at her career and trying to decide what to do. And he said, that's where it hit me, that I have a responsibility as a male executive leader to make sure that women are being promoted. He said, without looking at my own family, I probably would not have seen that recognition. So I think every one of us has to, whether or not it's your own family or your neighbor's family or a relative, you have to understand other people's point of view. I'm going to diverge a minute for something because it hit me this morning thinking about this topic on my way to work. I liken it to going to another country. So I used to teach foreign languages, and I spent a lot of time outside the US, and learning the language of another country is like learning the culture. And while you might say, this is the word or the term I use for this, it doesn't make a sense in another country. I do see that sometimes we have to get out of our own way and start realizing I have to look at this as if I'm in another culture and looking at it from a different lens. And it's you wake up and you start realizing you put bias out there without knowing it, but you can overcome it if you start thinking, I'm going to be a forensic anthropologist or an ethnographer and understand what is this person seeing and how are they approaching it. And I do think those of us in HR have a leg up because that's what we spend a lot of time doing. We're constantly mediating or trying to come up with the other person's perspective. I think also really important is training and, it's not just unconscious bias training. I don't know if that goes that long, but I think it's educating leaders to look at what does make an excellent director or a vice president. We often come into this thinking the person has to look like Joe or Mary or Pete. So we're using our frameworks that may have been formed a decade ago, and they're not necessarily the way you want to go. You need to look beyond. Sometimes I think we get into groupthink, and that's where, well, if everyone else is supporting this person, I need to. And there's sometimes a fear at the senior level of standing out or saying, asking questions so that we're really, again, looking internally at what we're doing. But no question about it, it's also career field choice. There's so much work out there now on making sure that women are getting into careers that will move them up. So I look at my career and I picked a staff job. Human resources is not a line job, it's a staff job. And not that you can't move up to the top in HR, but I do find that those women who go into line positions, operations, technology, engineering, product development, finance, there you go. Those jobs that are driving revenue-facing jobs, sales, they have a faster track to the top because they see the whole business. And I really encourage schools and colleges and those of us who mentor young people to tell them, don't just limit yourself to what you're comfortable with. Push yourself outside of your own comfort zone.
Mm-hmm. I think that's excellent. And I think your point about having an acknowledgement and acceptance, personally, the bias exists in each of us and it flavors our decisions every day. The bias, if you have a brain, you have bias. It's the mental shortcuts that we take when we take our own frameworks to make quick decisions. And some of those are pretty low stake decisions, but that it can really exist and flavor big stake and high stake decisions such as who's going to lead our organization. I have my own personal experience and I would like to tout myself as someone, having a long career in both psychology and business and dedicating much of my career to fair and high quality business decision making. And yet on the day that we elect the celebrant for our wedding, I had an idea in my mind of, what kind of figure, what kind of person was going to need to be up there and making sort of the authoritative decision that my husband and I would be officially married. And when I made the decision of what felt right, we selected an older gentleman. And when I examined what felt right, it was really contrasting for me and made very clear for me how I made that decision about what felt right in my gut based on my previous experiences and how that contrasted with the actual objective competency criteria. We just needed someone that could speak for 2 minutes and file some paperwork. Those were the competencies that were going to make this person successful. But the feeling about what makes a leader really interfered with those decisions. Fortunately, it all went smoothly. It was a whole 5-minute process. It's not going to make or break the success of my marriage. I hope, time will tell. But it does seem that so many organizations are still making these decisions on, I know Joe, I have a good feeling. They've just got the right stuff for leadership. And, when research tells us that, in fact, it's competencies and clear demonstrated competencies that are going to make for good leaders. And women are absolutely equally showing, and in some cases, showing stronger levels of competence and potential for leadership positions. So I think your point about training really being much more about, we're not going to train the bias out of us, but maybe let's train ourselves on what really strong leadership is about. And it isn't necessarily someone you've been playing golf with, or someone you've known for 20 years, or someone you just have a good feeling about. There are some clear criteria for what good leaders really need to look like. This is, obviously then brings around to the types of leadership that you're bringing to Aurora Organic Dairy. And, what steps is the organization there taking to attempt to mitigate bias in important high-stake talent decisions? Is it an organization that's ready to make some changes? And, where are you starting, Robin, in making sure those decisions are high quality?
Absolutely. And I'm sure the folks listening to this, or people who have been in the HR world in succession planning and leadership development, have always done the traditional, let's go through our 9-box, let's sit down and do a calibration. And I think there's a place for that, because it's something that, we all understand, and there is value. However, one of the things that we're now doing at Aurora Organic, and it's a new process because this company has not gone through what I call an OPR, an organizational and talent review process, at least at the senior level in the past, is we're injecting in some more subjectivity. So in addition to looking at, so we start with, what's the org profile? What do we need? What are the biggest challenges each one of our functional areas, operations and line, and staff has over the next 5 years? So we're starting with, let's look at the business case first, typical SWOT, you might say. And then from there, we're specifically looking at what are the skills and the competencies needed just really to hit these goals. It's not so much what makes a good leader, or who's someone who we think could fit in. It's very much based on the skill. So if we have a technology revolution or evolution coming up, then we need to find people with that skill. If we're changing our customer base, if we're modifying how we run our plants, we need people with those skills. So we're starting with the fact of, what is that skill? And I think it pulls out from that fuzzy area of competency and leadership that is sort of not as easy to touch and feel. And then from there, we're doing an internal risk assessment. So based on the fact that we need these 5 or 10 or whatever number of skills we have for get us to the next 5 years, who has that skill inside the company? So it's not so much who's the person, but what's the skill. And what we're beginning to see is there are multiple people who have pieces of the skills we need. And it is not just that one individual who we want to promote. It's like, well, we got 5 people who all have a piece of that. Then we're looking at how could we develop that skill? So we're looking at an external risk. If this person were to leave, or these 3 people were to leave, is it easy to find the skill in the marketplace? And then finally, we're coming down to our 9-box. So knowing that we already know these skills are critical, justifying why someone's in the upper right quadrant or the middle quadrant is less about what they've done in the past and more about the skill they're bringing to help us into the future. So we're looking at creating the skill set, which I think is going to get us to the point of developing our curriculum. Once we've identified who, we don't yet have a leadership development program in place, and I'm going to borrow on things that I've done at different companies in the past that are different industries, first of all, but there's some overlap, and create a more of a, what do I call it, a cohort of leaders, small group who will be coming from different departments, different functions in the company. And the goal in this is to cross-pollinate, but also to give them some scenario planning. So give them some data and say, this is a challenge for us coming forward. We know not one of you has all of these skills, but we intentionally picked a diverse group of individuals who we think exhibit some of the skills we need, and we want you to come up with a solution. So in addition to developing and training and giving them exposure to senior leaders and outside mentors, they will also have an opportunity to work together. We'll be able to observe them during this work, because it will take place over the course of 15 to 18 months, and they'll be coming up with their solutions and presenting it at the end of that time period to our senior leaders. But I think if we're looking at it in a fairly broad, flat lens, we want to give these people exposure. We want them to use their own talents, but we also want to make sure that we're developing that future pipeline of leaders without a bias to what their gender may be.
Mm. I think that there's some really powerful things that you've pointed out that I'm sure HR practitioners on our call today would really acknowledge as some best practices. And the first one I heard you talk about is that starting with what's the business landscape that you're entering in the years ahead, and the skills that you're going to need to meet those challenges, and that you're starting to put a much more objective lens around, well, what do we need our leaders of the future to possess, and you're really asking the questions about what does the business need rather than who do I like. And I think you said, this is going to be much more about what's the skills rather than who's the person. And I think most of the research in this space would say if you are tight on your criteria before you start to put names on the board, the whole conversation can change very quickly when we're making criteria based decisions rather than good feelings and sort of evaluative decisions. The other thing I heard you say there, Robin, which I think is powerful, which is, it is only after having a very clear picture with the business leaders influencing those decisions that, high potentials or future leaders will be identified, but with an idea that those future leaders are being identified with, potential in mind. We're not looking for high performance in the short term. We're looking for them to demonstrate their potential and giving lots of people the opportunity to grow their skills with special projects, simulated business issues, being able to expand their experience, over the course of time, rather than just identifying and eyeballing, well, I think it's Sam and Joe and, and Blake, and, those are the people we're going to, advance for the future. And I think that's some really powerful activity there. But this is also some new activity that you're undertaking. This is new work for the organization, right?
Right, completely new. I do as an experiment. I find it's fun. I mean, and when it's new, you pilot it, you try it out. Yes.
Absolutely. I think, the thing that I hear when I talk about the results of our research paper and also the challenges that I think we're meeting, HR leaders say, yes, but, I would love to be repairing the broken rung, but either we have a lack of urgency around here, or I don't have good buy-in around the executive team, or we have cultural pressure to maintain the status quo, or but people just think it's not broken, so why do we need to change the way we do things? People feel very comfortable with their trusted process, and they say, well, I know Joe, and I can pick a good leader. And how did you bring about change? How did you open up the conversation in what I'm sure is a very, very well-established organization, very successful organization? How did you bring about the change to open the minds and the acceptance of a new process?
Yeah, I think you hit on a lot of the important things that, everyone finds their own place in a new company. So I've been at my organization for about 10 months. And while the topic of doing an organ talent review was from the very beginning on my radar, and it was on my list of expectations that I had for myself, and my CEO who I report to understood, I didn't even bring this topic up until 4 months ago. And it was, you have to sort of start figuring out how you fit. By the time I had developed enough of a rapport with my peers on the senior team, and to talk about, have you thought about, some informal conversations? What's your plan for your future? Who's your best leader right now? Opening up just very informal conversations made them realize, wow, I don't have any successor, or if I do, I don't have a broad enough selection criteria, or I'm afraid my most important person might be a flight risk. That's where leadership buy-in happened. It was not a requirement, because this company has never done it before, and we've been around for 30 years. But it was also a leader expectation that we're entering new markets. And I think that's a perfect time for HR to be able to insert an idea of, okay, getting into new markets, uncharted territory. Do we know where we're going? Do we know who can get us there? So it starts with that executive leadership, peer influence, and other people saying, wow, this is something that we really could use. And then by the time you've worked through a few of your early adopters, the rest of my peers came around and said, we'll do it. And I made the process so easy. It's I really did most of the work for them. We sat down together. So I think as much as HR can take off the plate of the executive, it's important. The other thing I think it's important to know is that your needs that you have may not be the same as another company. So you have to look at the market. I think as companies start realizing that they don't want to be left behind, that there are so much demand right now for top talent. I know we hear about that, but it's been going on for a good 15 years and it's probably not going to let up anytime soon at the top. When you start thinking, I might be losing some of my top leaders, that also is like a wake-up call to, we need to take a look at this importantly and make sure that we're not going to lose our most important resource, which are our employees. You know, there's always a conversation about, do we tell people where they sit in terms of their leadership? And I think that's a personal decision that each company has to make. It has to be consistent and make sure it's rolled out. But there are some organizations that believe employees should know if they're identified in a top group, but other organizations don't. In our case, since we'll be doing our leadership training that's really going to bring a cohort together, I think people will look and say, oh, well, these are probably the folks we're considering. However, you know, my goal is to quickly roll on more than one at a different level so that people realize I don't have to be at the very top to be someone that has an opportunity for development. And I want to be able to identify women at lower levels in the organization and give them these opportunities, at least to start being known and getting onto projects that are going to help give them more visibility into the organization. And then I think what we've certainly talked about is you watch people, you know, this idea of you know, not requiring people to necessarily demonstrate performance on the job, but you watch them in difficult situations. And I'll be honest with you, what's going on right now in the world in the last few weeks has been fascinating. You start seeing who are the leaders who know how to send the right message to an organization and who are those who don't. And perhaps, you know, I could think of a few cases where we might have thought that this person was clearly a successor, but we're starting to see a few areas where they need some development and they need some help. And watching people when they're not on, you know, in their element, when they're being pulled into these uncomfortable areas, really opens up the view of what does a real leader take. And I think that I'm hoping and expecting a lot of executive teams will start looking around and saying, okay, I need leaders who could get me through these uncharted territories and rocky waters like we're seeing right now. And it may not be the person you thought of.
I think that's a very nice point and makes it a very relevant conversation, that it might be tempting for many organizations to sideline these processes right now as we start to deal with some, you know, urgent issues. But I think we could expect that the need for strong and capable leadership is only going to be exacerbated in our uncertain times. And it's pretty easy to be a good manager when things are strong, we're in a strong economy, we're in a growth economy, but it really now I think is going to force organizations to think quite critically about what are the skills that they need and what will be the processes that will enable those skills to rise to the top, to become visible, so that we can identify that talent hiding in plain sight. And I'll bring it back to, I think one of the first things you said there, Robin, is that HR leaders have an opportunity to repair the broken rung and take care of diversity by thinking as business leaders and being aware of, as you said, the constituents and the customer base that you serve, the broader economic landscape that we are entering, going to the areas of business and asking what are the problems that you need solving in the next few years in regards to leadership. Do you have successes? Are you confident in the talent, you know, a generation behind you? What will be the, you know, the issues that you'll be facing that I can help you in HR solve? And I can solve it with best practices. And when we have good best practices in our HR processes, diversity can take care of itself in that regard. But this isn't a diversity issue. This is a talent issue that we can address. I think those are powerful words. So Robin, then where to from here? I mean, it is uncertain times, and this might have been a very different answer had I asked you a month ago, but what are you hoping for when you think about the years ahead for Aurora Organic Dairy, or even the talent landscape? You know, what are you hoping becomes the new normal for talent decision making, for talent management, for leadership growth?
Well, you know, obviously, ultimately, like your survey, your report showed, and the research, the goal is to get the right people in the right seats at the right time, and that is just always been the, you know, the mantra, I think, of talent leaders and senior executives as well. And I think the data that you presented certainly show that we have a long way to come, and we won't get away from our own biases. We have to just put them out there, recognize they're there, and be able to move forward. And I think one of the most important hopes that I have for the future and for the data that you've presented as well is that we are able to diversify our leadership pipeline. We have, I can't continue to state it often enough that without having diversity of thought in an executive room, we really are missing the economic side of what's going to make a company successful and the economy as a whole. If we cannot promote the 51%, I think, of our workforce or of our population in the U.S. that is female, and obviously on the racial minority, actually not even minority side, but the racial and ethnicity side, it's even larger. We as a nation, as a world, are not going to be able to realize all the gains that we potentially could have and successes that people could have, both economically as well as socially. For us specifically at our company, we do a very good job, like a lot of companies, of attracting women into mid-manager roles. I don't think we do a good job certainly on the line side of promoting. And I look at our few females in line roles, and I'm just thrilled to see women supervisors in the production line or in one of our organic farms, because that sends a message to everybody else to say, if this person can do it, and if they're a strong performer, anyone can. So for me, it's that diversity of attracting people. At this point, it's been a world lately where employers have scrambled to try to find talent for their organizations, and everybody is out there trying to make their company an employer of choice, so to speak. And I do think that people are looking carefully and saying, well, if I go to that company, am I going to be able to realize my career aspirations and my potential financial aspirations? And that's where I hope we're going to move. And then I think I said earlier too, most of our industries, we have women making major purchase decisions. And the ability to have women in those roles is not just because it's a nice thing to do or because it feels good. It's because they're the ones driving decisions. And it helps to have a female voice who is understanding at the very top, driving that conversation and being able to represent that consumer out there very carefully.
Fantastic. Well, I think that's a wonderful vision for thinking about the effects that taking care of, even some of the small activity in HR practices can have a significant impact on attracting great talent, retaining great talent, and enabling talent to have an impact on the bottom line of the organization, but also our communities and our global economy. I think that people in positions of human resource and human capital management are the heroes of what's possible, and with good courage and good practice can make significant impacts, not just in the practices and the policies of their organization, but in the world at general. And heaven knows we need good leadership and courageous leadership in today's uncertain times. Robin, I just cannot thank you enough for being able to share your broad perspective and your vast experience in leading transformation in global organizations, multiple industries, being able to see the world both as a business leader, a people leader, and a community member. Robin, it's just been so rich to have you here sharing your experience and how you're approaching this complicated topic. I will thank you again in just a moment, but I do want to just give our audience here a chance to get in on what we've been talking about, which is the research paper that is, as of today, being released on the website. So it has been in publication and editing for the last couple of months. It is now available. So please, if you have found this topic interesting and if you are curious about what Robin and I are so curious about with these findings, head on over to www.repairtherun.com, or you can also find it on our Pinsight website as well. So hopefully that provides value to the folks that have joined us here and can spark even more good quality conversations like we've had here about what's happening and what's possible and what we need to do.